Well, now we need to look back and get the real essence of what we've been doing, what I would like to call the abstract properties, primarily of the levels. This is something that escapes people, even if they've been listening to lectures for a year or two. They still, one of my best friends, it was 3 years before he got the nature of the second level, and I'm still not sure that he has it. Of course, we've made a run through a sort of intellectual overview of this vast process of nature, and we ought to be a little suspicious of whether we've really picked up the real essence of each thing. Now, because we're accustomed to mapping and systems theory and words, we think when we have the word, we have the thing. Now that's true for the third level. The third level is concepts, so when we have the concept, we've got it, we've got the answer. That's why the atom is so thoroughly understood. Remember I said every atom is made out of protons and electrons, and the difference between the atoms depends solely on the number of proton-electron pairs. It's really fantastic. It's much more Pythagorean than anyone would have dreamed possible, that just number alone should describe the property of the atom, and that for every number there would be a unique atom, and for every atom there would be one number. But that's not true of the other three levels. The fourth level is one's actual encounter with the physical world. And you can have all kinds of abstract ideas and all kinds of names and still not be able to drive a nail, or much less build a house or build a computer. But when you try to build a house or build a computer, you would be able to learn something you didn't know before, and thereby provide feedback and greatly enrich the third level concept that you started with. So we can generalize and talk about the fourth level as that factor in experience that you couldn't get without the outside world, without effort, without trying to make things, without trying to do things, without living. But what is the fourth level? The fourth level is the combination of the third and the second. The third we can completely know by concepts. What then is the second? This is the level that's subtlest and most important. Important because it's neglected. Important because when you map it, you still don't catch its essence. It's the element of experience, which is to say, values, yearnings, longing, all those forces in yourself that on the one hand attract you, on the other you avoid. If you like, it's the realm of archetypes, such as Jung describes in dreams. The terrible father, the terrible mother, the beautiful anima, the shadow. These things that the Tibetans recognize as the wrathful demons. The energies in the self that have to be met and conquered before they can become our allies. Castaneda refers to it in the teachings of Don Juan as his own encounter. Do you remember when he sees the bush as a fearful I don't know what it was, mountain lion or something. And then his smart guy side comes up and says, oh no, it's just a bush. But Don Juan says, no, go on, you have to go back and see it as a terrible mountain lion that you're afraid of, because that terrible mountain lion still has to be dealt with. He was not concerned with the fact that it was an illusion. What was important was the fact that the power of this illusion was still not assimilated into Castaneda's repertoire so that it could be used as an ally. Now this brings us in direct confrontation with the difference between the right and left-hand side of the arc. The left-hand side of the arc is the descent into matter. So it is the things that trap you. I called the second charge, I also called it binding, but I could call it illusion. This is what makes life real, and life is, to put it in a nutshell, is the kind of troubles you run into. So, the entrapment of the second level is to create some illusion. And you have to live through this, and to get through it, you need the third stage intellect to be able to navigate your way through. This is what Castaneda would call the tonal. You have to get the tonal all correct before you're again able to tackle the sixth stage on your way back up. So the abstract principles, which I'm now interpreting in terms of man, are involve the actual experiencing, gut-level dealing with life, as well as the mapping or conceptual dealing with it. One way to put it is that second level deals with the mythos, whereas third level deals with the logos. Third level is concept, second level is experience. Now that leaves the first level completely without any description, and I'm afraid that that's the way it has to stay. Since it's uncertainty, since it's totally volition, totally voluntary, any designation placed on it would turn it into something else. One word for it is ineffable, unnameable. But you get to the same answer if you talk about it as infinite, because as soon as you put words on it, it bounds it. So we don't have to describe the first level, but we have to realize that it remains there as a potency. It is the energy, it is the action that propels the whole thing, that starts it off and pushes it through the stages of evolution. And we could comment on evolution, but I'll come to that later. So to make it really simple, there are two basic principles. One is intellectual, third level, conceptual, knowing things. And the other is second level, the experience, value, substance. A lot of other words that I can't think of at the moment, but that involve dealing. You see, my difficulty in finding a word takes me back to the principle that we put on the second level, the line. Anything that can be given a value would be second level. Whereas anything that can be measured would be third level. Now that seems as though I'm saying the same thing, but giving a value is entirely different than measuring, because a measurement is a reference to something else. I have to know what the something else is, whereas a value is something that concerns you. Someone wondered why I put substance and value together, and I happened to get it off the top of my head. I asked him, would he agree that substance was equivalent to matter? He said yes. And I said, well, why do we say something matters then? Something matters because it has value to us. So matter, substance, and value go together. But if you're ever caught jumbled with words, go back to this principle that of a one-dimensional line. If I'm going to show this, I better put up a chart. And say, once again, second level, which was the line, is also the longing, whereas third level, which is the plane, is the concept. Fourth level being their combination, and there's really not much we can say about the physical world without projecting concepts upon it. I say this is a chair, or this is a rug, or this is a shoe, but that's not really second level. Fourth level. I used to say to the engineers at the helicopter project, what is a helicopter? And they'd sort of gesture, well, that machine we're making out in the shop, that's a helicopter. Say, no. Helicopter is really a function rather than a thing. You might say that the first automobile that was built that looked like a carriage was an automobile. But the automobile kept evolving to a more and more efficient shape for its function, so that now it doesn't resemble a carriage at all. So the automobile is really the end of the line. Well, in a somewhat similar fashion, you burden yourself with unnecessary impediments when you say, this is a chair. Of course it's a chair, but if you were trying to make the perfect chair, it wouldn't be the chair. The real chair is beyond, is that which inspires you to make a better chair. Well, I think we have a pretty good summary now of the abstract properties. Let's see how they work. My favorite area for demonstration is the molecular kingdom, the chemicals. And I think there's a good reason for it. One is that scientists know more about chemicals than anything else. They know enough to synthesize. There's still a lot to know, but they know enough to be able to synthesize many of the chemicals that the body makes. So they really know something about what's going on. And the breakdown of the chemical kingdom that was given to me by Charles Price, who was a top chemist, he was head of the American Chemical Society when I approached him, has been invaluable to me. Let me go back. You remember in the grid, the first chemicals were metals, of course. They were single units. The next chemicals were the simple compounds. the next one was what he called non-functional compounds, and the fourth one was functional compounds. The fifth was non-functional polymers, and the sixth was non-functional polymers. I'm getting mixed up. The fifth was non-functional polymers, and the sixth was functional polymers, or proteins, and the seventh, DNA. Now you notice that the 1, 1, 2, that is to say this repetition that I referred to earlier, shows in the substages of the chemicals. First you have molecules made out of 1, then you have the repetition of 1 in the compounds. Then you'll have what he calls non-functional compounds, and then functional compounds. You see, you've used the same word twice. The second and the fourth repeats the theme of the first and the third. The same happens again with the fifth, non-functional polymers and functional polymers. Now, even chemists sometimes find this difficult because these words that he chose were as a result of some thought about my problem being to assign 7 stages to chemicals. But they've been invaluable to me because not only have I not had to change the words, see, he told me this before I discovered the 112 thing, but I've learned something from this assignment of names to apply to other kingdoms. Let me sum up now. I've got a number of principles which we've discussed during the 2 seminars. The difference between the levels, the different degrees of freedom, then the similarity between the right and left-hand sides of the arc. 2 is similar to 6, and 3 is similar to 5. The cumulativeness by which each kingdom builds on what occurred before. The 112, where the odd kingdoms innovate and the even kingdoms recapitulate. There's one more principle that I need to mention, which is that as you go down the descent and come back up again, you descend from unity into diversity. Here we had one kind of photon, then 2 kinds of particles, 92 kinds of atoms, unlimited number of molecules, and we could find about the polymers, that there are a great many kinds of polymers. Now, when we come to proteins, there are also a great many proteins, but there's only one kind of chain on which the proteins are built. And finally, when we come to DNA, all DNA has the same overall shape, the spiral helix. Now, I need this sorting to illustrate the diversity. From unity into diversity, back into unity. Now, this was the last thing I found before I published the book. In a way, it's the neatest. See, what I liked about this whole theory was the way, having started making pieces here, then a piece here, and then a piece there, when I found new pieces, it all fit together and made something much bigger than I dreamed of when I started. it was almost like excavating a city. At one point I'd dig up a street and then I'd figure out, well, there must be an intersection over here, and sure enough it was. But some of the things were a complete surprise to me. For instance, this principle of from unity to diversity and back to unity. Now, often when I describe this arc to people, they say, well, isn't it getting back to the same place? In other words, it starts out at one, and it goes through all this toil and struggle, and gets back to one again. So it's like a circle going back into itself. Well, that's to miss the important point, because while it's gone down into means, into these other categories of things, and it gets back to freedom, the freedom that it started with was a helpless freedom that didn't have any scope, it didn't have any competence, just rattled around. Whereas the freedom that it acquires at the end of all this arc is that of a God, having his own universe. And I would remind you that while you're not gods, you've made some steps in this direction because of the vast multitude of subsystems that you include. Even as an animal, you consist of, something like hundreds of trillions of cells. And each cell, which contains well over 1 billion molecules, is of greater complexity than the entire organization of General Motors. You're sitting on top of all this. I'm sitting on top of mine, and you're listening to me. We're acting as unitary creatures. So all this diversity culminates in a freedom, and you're able to operate over a much larger scope than you were when you were just one particle. Well, these abstract properties, we're going to have to really use them now. We're going to have to step beyond science and use the foundation provided by the arc and the grid to talk about something that science really isn't able to talk about. Before I say what this is, let me go back here to our diagram, plants and animals. What's the essential difference between a plant and an animal? Now, people are always talking about how you could make computers that were like living creatures. They would talk about a computer that can choose and things like that. It might have a random switch in it and it would do unexpected things. But what's really lacking in the computer that is present in life, especially animal life, is the principle of longing or attraction that's typical of second level. Animals are attracted to things, primarily to food or to their mates. And the attraction is intimately involved with their motion, because the reason they move from one thing to another is to either get food or find a mate or escape from enemies or chase a competitor. They are doing various activities, and those activities are one and the same thing as their animation. In other words, animals have the animated principle, and the word animate connects with anima, which is the word for soul. Now, this suggests that animals have something the plants don't have. Well, why should a soul be different? If it's a living principle, but why isn't it already incorporated in the plant? It's because the plant doesn't have a choice. It's true that the plant moves toward the light, and it can decide to move or not to move, but it doesn't choose goals. If you have a potato in the cellar and it sends out a shoot, there are two windows. It doesn't choose one window rather than the other. It just goes toward maximum light. Whereas an animal will go toward a target, be another animal or whatever. Now this choosing is included in what I would call the mobility principle, which is voluntary motion. In other words, the volition chooses a target and goes toward it. This is wrapped up in the notion of the animating principle, the anima, and hence the soul. Now the soul is second level. Because it's second level, it has no identity. Now we recall that the identity principle in atoms was due to the fact that the atom was constructed out of a nucleus and the shell electrons. Now when those shell electrons are stripped away, it either becomes another kind of, well, when the nucleus is split, it becomes another kind of atom. It loses that identity. But if you try to split the particles, you can't do it. In other words, there's a basis where you can't go beyond. The substance itself cannot be destroyed. We're now ready to talk about this delicate and embarrassing question of immortality. See, most people rule out immortality on the grounds that there's no evidence for it and therefore it's not scientific. But you could think of it the other way around. It's the mortality that there's no evidence for. Understand, we're talking about the second level. We're not talking about the things that are constructed, such as bodies. Bodies are made up of molecules, or they're made up of cells. And when the body dies, it's destroyed. But what we want to know is whether the animating principle of the body is destroyed. And this animating principle, being an energy and not being made up of parts, there is no possible way to destroy it, any more than there is a way to destroy ordinary energy. Since it's all made of the same thing, it can't change shape, and according to science, energy is conserved. This is that great principle, conservation of energy, conservation of mass, conservation of energy. So you could say that the soul in principle must be immortal because it's an energy, and according to science, the principle of conservation of energy means that it couldn't be destroyed. So we have to be ready for that kind of thing, and this gives us grounds for talking about it, because here we're giving sanction to the second level, to a principle of something that cannot be destroyed. Why can't it be destroyed? Because it's not constructed. Destroy is to destruct. Destruction. What is constructed can undergo destruction. But what is not constructed, i.e., energy, soul, cannot be destructed. Well, what is it then? Why do we have a soul? Well, as I said before, this is the level of experience. And the monad, which is the first principle, comes into matter in order to acquire experience. The way it experiences is through the soul. and I said it didn't have identity. It has no need for identity. This is the reason you're not able to remember your past lives. Suppose I were to say, well, in my past life I was a carpenter in Egypt or something. Well, it's of absolutely no significance that I was a carpenter in Egypt now. It might give me some facility in carpentry today, but this identity I had then is like a last year's credit card. You're supposed to destroy it. It doesn't carry over into this life. The things that carry over are the values I got as a carpenter in Egypt. I might have learned how to love my children or learned how to do some other skills. That value I retain. But my identity as a certain person has I have no further use for that meaning, so I might as well take it apart and put it together as something else. Now realize, of course, that we've got sanction for to make this kind of language. Science would not find this easy to talk about because it's saying that those objects out there are the only reality, whereas we're making an inquiry as to how the objects get that reality. Well, this leads me then to be able to talk about the soul of an animal. But what's interesting about the soul of an animal as contrasted with the human soul is that the animal has a group soul. And the group soul, it's not just another fantasy, another groundless speculation, because it has very profound explanatory power. It explains instinct. I've always felt that the DNA could not explain instinct. The example, well, there are hundreds of examples of the elaborate instincts in animals. The one I use in the book is about the European blackcap, which is a small bird, songbird, that winters. It winters in Egypt and summers in Germany, so it has to migrate from Germany to Egypt. The young birds have to fly to Egypt. And they found, by putting young birds in a planetarium, that before they've ever made the trip with their parents, they're able to navigate by the stars and follow the course that would take them to Egypt by the sky as it would appear at various points in their journey. Thus, if the sky of Italy is shown, they fly east. If the sky of Persia is shown, they fly west. And they fly first to Turkey, which is southeast of Germany, and then they fly south to Egypt. Now, I think it would be impossible to encode the necessary information for navigation by the stars in the DNA. And it's it's a different kind of thing. It's just as different as driver skill is different from the blueprints that make the automobile. You can do all kinds of things with the design of the automobile, but the driver habits depend on previous training and learning. So too, the structure and color of the animal depend on the DNA blueprint, but the behavior of the animal, the instinctual behavior, depends on some kind of previous memory. Now, the birds, after I'd started writing about it, another article was published in Scientific American which helped clinch my point, because this scientist who had done the first experiment carried it a step further. And, well, he first found that the young birds had to be exposed to the night sky or they weren't able to do the navigation. In other words, it was necessary for them to learn where the stars were by looking up at the heavens before they could migrate. This again suggests it was not coded in the DNA. A further point was that he changed the night sky so that instead of the North Star being Polaris, it was in Betelgeuse or some other constellation, so that it was the sky that might have happened, let's say, 10,000 years ago when the North Pole was in a different place because of the precession of the equinoxes, that thing that carries the Earth's axis around like a spinning top that's slowing down. Every 24,000 years it makes a circle of the heavens and the North Star moves. Well, in other words, the birds were able to navigate as though the North Star were Betelgeuse instead of Polaris. Well, that's one example, but there are many others. Some moths even navigate by the stars. And the complexity of many insects, the wasp that buries its egg in a caterpillar and stings the caterpillar in precisely the right place so that it stays alive but is unable to move and hence incubates the eggs. That kind of thing couldn't be coded in DNA because caterpillars are almost any place. You could make a map of where hidden treasure was, move so many feet north of such and such a tree, but that isn't the same as finding a caterpillar in some unknown location. That has to be done by behavior. In any case, that's the way I try to make the idea of the soul acceptable, because it's indicated by the principles set forth here. What do I mean by that? I mean that the soul is a value principle, quite different from DNA, which would be at this level, which is a pattern principle. The DNA, like a blueprint or a diagram, describes a structure, whereas instinct describes a series of acts in time. In other words, a linear sequence. Now then, we can talk about man. How does man differ from animals? I think that's where the payoff is maximum here, because this principle that I earlier alluded to, that we're coming back to unity, man has to individuate, have his own soul as against the group soul of animals. Now this takes me to another chart, which is the one I have on the cover of the book. This chart shows the three evolutions. Now, notice that I should have numbered these, but I didn't have time. This would correspond to light, 1, and this particles, 2, this 2 atoms, molecules, plants, animals, and man. Now, the evolution you normally hear about, which is the evolution of DNA, is the evolution of a chromosome long DNA helix of chromosomes that describe how the creature is going to be constructed, literally blueprints. And it moves from this stage, which we call concept, through trial and actually survival, because the DNA causes different combinations, but only certain ones survive. And when they survive, they become the basis for the plant growth. So from concept through survival of the fittest, you get the DNA that can meet the requirements of evolution and survive. This is the normal evolution described in the biology books. On the other hand, we have a totally different kind of evolution that is possible. In the case of DNA, we started with pattern and ended with pattern, with the testing occurring at the fourth level. On the other hand, if we start with attraction, that's the essence of the second kingdom, longing, through trial and error, we can learn a pattern, learn a behavior. Thus, a rat is taught to go through a maze with the lure of food. He'll try to find how to get through the maze, and by trial and error gets to the food, and then remembers how he did it. This is the basis of many of those tests of psychology of animals. And this would be how any animal learned a particular set of behaviors. If you were to teach a dog, you give him a reward for what you want him to do, or you punish him for what you don't want him to do. He learns by trial and error that this pattern of behavior will get him the rewards and avoid the unpleasantness. And with the concept of the group soul, we can think of this evolution having occurred over hundreds of thousands, millions of years. One example I like very much is the Bedlington. The Bedlington, very beautiful dog, but they're very hard to breed. The reason is that these dogs, which were raised by Arabs who had no way of penning up the female dog when the female was in heat, so they'd kick or beat the male dogs and prevent them from breeding, so that over thousands of years, breeding has become associated with being beaten, and they're very hard to breed. Now, you couldn't explain this in terms of DNA. Although one student that I told this to said, oh yes, the ones that don't breed are the ones that survive. Well, if that's an explanation. All right, we have two kinds of evolution. What about man? For man, there is a third kind of evolution. Naturally, his animal organism has instincts, such as the fear of falling, which are inherited over this long period. And he depends on his DNA just as the animals do. But he has an additional kind of evolution all of his own. And I'd almost like you to guess this, but I can't get feedback, so I'll just have to tell you. We start with one, which is light. And we, again, the testing ground is the physical universe. Now, at least for me, this suggests what you do when you make experiments with nature. You try something and you see how it works. It's not just this, it's not the trial and error of the rat going through the maze, because you're looking for a principle. And once you can recognize a principle, let's say, well, for Galileo it was the law of falling bodies, or for Newton the law of gravitation. All these scientific laws and principles have involved what I would call an aha. Suddenly you see it. Light dawns. The light that began it comes back up, and you recognize a truth. You see that this is the way things are. And that kind of evolution gives you the chance to move ahead much faster than the animals. Because even in one lifetime, you can learn a lot by learning principles instead of isolated instances. And this is what we're going to have to rely on. And incidentally, this is what I believe the turn to be in terms of man. In other words, when you see how the law works at this point in determinism, in determinate matter, then you can begin to return to the heavenly state. To sum up then, we have these three types of evolution, but all of them hinge on this critical turn in the fourth stage. It might be the fourth substage, but it's the fourth. I don't know whether I mentioned it, but this is what in myth is called the virgin birth. And I'd like to explain a little about that. Naturally, as a sort of, well, in my growing up years, I was much more impressed by science than I was by religion. And when we had to read things about the virgin birth and so on in Sunday school, it just seemed like a superfluous superstition, something that had no particular meaning. It sounded sort of purist. If anything, I wanted to go the other way. Well, I've learned differently since. The virgin birth really has nothing to do with purity. It's a symbol. And one of the most interesting things, in fact, I'd almost say the most interesting thing in my career subsequent to the helicopter, has been the realization that symbols are quite a different thing than I thought they were. To me, as interested in mathematics, a symbol was an arbitrary designation, like X was the unknown. It could just as well be Y or something else. But that's not real symbolism. Symbolism is a language that, in a sense, doesn't need translation. It's a language that you encounter in dreams. Now, to be sure, you have to find out what the things mean, but that's because we've gotten away from direct meanings. But to get back to the virgin birth, what does the virgin birth mean? Well, a virgin birth is a birth without a father. What's a father? A father is a cause, like in the sentence, the wish is father to the deed. The wish is the cause of the deed. So a virgin birth is something that doesn't have a cause. In other words, it's first cause. Now, first cause is a very important thing. if you're a complete rationalist, you would have to say that first cause couldn't exist. But then you'd be stuck as to how the universe started. In fact, as an inventor, I would like to testify that first cause can often exist. In fact, the definition of invention by the Patent Office, definition of novelty, is that the idea must be such that one skilled in the art would not have thought of it. In other words, it has no antecedent, it has no cause. It's a breakthrough, it's a quantum jump. Well, let's look back at the ark. The virgin birth is a rebirth of the principle that was there that started it all off. And this is very well described in religion. Christian religion has the virgin was conceived of the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Ghost is shown as a dove descending from above. Something comes down, and it's also coming from within, because this life spark, this thing that started it all off, continues throughout. And it is the basis of this freedom of choice that occurs at the turn. So the virgin birth is when this light spark is reawakened and takes charge of the situation and decides to move back to the source.